Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, January 31st, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Poland says that it is ready to send F-16s to Ukraine in coordination with NATO. So, Polish officials said on Monday that they are ready to send some of their US made F 16 fighter jets to Ukraine, but only in coordination with other NATO countries. So, since, of course, the US and Germany said they're going to send their tanks, Ukrainian officials have been demanding fighter jets. That's their next goal, is to get Western made fighter jets, which would mark another huge escalation of Western military aid. So it was interesting. On Monday, President Biden was asked if the U.S. would be sending F 16s to Ukraine, and he simply replied, no. So the reason why that's not the headline of the story is because I've seen Biden do this before where he gives these very simple one word answers and there's no elaboration. This was when he got off Air Force One. There was no follow up question like, do you mean now or ever? So we can't really judge too much from that simple reply. And U.S. officials previously said that they wouldn't give Ukraine the M1 Abrams tanks just a few days before Biden announced it. Pentagon officials were saying they weren't going to send it. So we know that throughout the war, as Ukrainian officials have said, the U.S. has, initially didn't want to send the HIMARS rocket launchers, then they sent them. And then, there's a lot of examples of this. So just because Biden's saying no right now doesn't mean it should be ruled out, because we're just on this road of escalation. And Ukrainian officials, they appear pretty confident that they will receive F-16s or some other kind of fighter jet. As I went over yesterday, a Ukrainian Air Force spokesman said that work was being done to prepare Ukraine's airfields for these jets. Other Ukrainian officials have said, yeah, we're going to get the fighter jets, we're going to get the long-range missiles, we're going to get everything we want short of nuclear weapons. So in order to send their F-16s, this is similar again to the tank situation. It started really, the pressure on Germany to sign off on the Leopard tank deliveries really ramped up after Poland said, hey, we're ready to send some Leopards, let's do it. So now we have Poland saying, we're ready to send some F-16s. But in order to send them, Poland needs the approval of the U.S. under the export rules. And the Netherlands has also signaled that they might be willing to send Ukraine F-16s. So, countries are starting to line up saying that they're ready to do it. So far, there's no sign that a U.S. approval of the weapons transfer is imminent. And again, we saw Biden's comments, but over the weekend, Politico reported that the idea of sending the F-16s is gaining steam in Moscow. And again, sending these jets would risk provoking Moscow, would be another major escalation. But the U.S. isn't concerned about that. According to all these reports and their actions, they just don't worry about escalation anymore at this point, simply based on the fact that Russia hasn't used a nuke up to this point or attacked a NATO base. A very dangerous way of looking at things. All right, so the next one here, Croatia's president says that Western arms supplies to Ukraine are prolonging the war. So this is Zoran Milanovic. He is the president of Croatia, and he's criticized the policy of arming Ukraine a lot lately. And he said that sending tanks and other heavy weapons, by doing that, his fellow NATO members are prolonging the war. He said, quote, I am against sending any lethal arms there. It prolongs the war. What is the goal? Disintegration of Russia? Change of government? There is also talk of tearing Russia apart. This is mad, end quote. So he suggested that the war was provoked by the U.S. and NATO support for Ukraine following the 2014 ouster of Viktor Yanukovych, the former Ukrainian president who was deposed in the U.S.-backed coup. He said, quote, from 2014 to 2022, we are watching how someone provokes Russia with the intention of starting this war. What is the goal of this war? A war against a nuclear power that is at war in another country? Is there a conventional way to defeat such a country? Who pays the price? Europe. America pays the least, end quote. So again, he's very critical. He's not holding back in these comments. And Croatia is a NATO member. So it's interesting to see comments like this. He said what the Western powers are doing in Ukraine is deeply immoral. And he said that Crimea will never be, returned to Ukraine. And he compared the situation, this was interesting, in Crimea to Kosovo, which was separated from Serbia following the 1999 NATO bombing campaign. And it formally declared independence in 2008. So Croatia was not a NATO member, during this time. I believe they formally joined in 2009, I want to say. But it's interesting to hear him say this. He said, quote, "We have annexed Kosovo, we and the international community. It was taken from Serbia. Who did it if not us? We did recognize Kosovo after all. I'm not questioning Kosovo itself, but the entire concept," end quote. So he's one of the few leaders, again, of a NATO country who's speaking out against this policy. He also rejected an EU plan that would have had Croatia help Ukrainian troops. And he's not alone in this opposition, as this proposal to train Ukrainian soldiers failed to gain approval in Croatia's parliament. All right, so the next article here, this is that Rand Corporation report that is warning a long war in Ukraine is against U.S. interests. So the Rand Corporation issued a new report that warns against a protracted conflict in Ukraine and says that a prolonged war is against U.S. interests. And this is breaking from the view of many hawks in Washington that the U.S. should support the fight against Russia for the long term. So Rand is funded directly by the U.S. military and often shapes U.S. policies, including very hawkish policies toward Moscow. A 2019 Rand report titled "Extending Russia" examined the risks and benefits of ways that the U.S. could try to extend Russia, and many of those policies have been implemented, including the provisions of lethal aid to Ukraine. This was how they put it. They mean, when they say lethal aid, they mean weapons like that Ukraine could use in its war against in the Donbass, because the Obama administration didn't send weapons to Ukraine, but then Trump came in and sent the Javelin anti-tank missiles. And then, of course, that aid just increased exponentially since Russia invaded. They also proposed sanctions on Russia and hindering Russia's gas and oil exports. So this new report from Rand, titled "Avoiding a Long War," examines the risks of the current conflict and acknowledges that a protracted conflict heightens the risk of nuclear war. So a summary of the new report reads, quote, "Discussion of the Russia-Ukraine war in Washington is increasingly dominated by the question of how it might end. To inform this discussion, this perspective identifies ways in which the war could evolve and how alternative trajectories would affect U.S. interests. The authors argue that, in addition to minimizing the risks of a major escalation, U.S. interests would be best served by avoiding a protracted conflict," end quote. So the authors say that the war in Ukraine, this isn't all good in this report. Big part of their argument is that the war in Ukraine makes it harder for the U.S. to focus on its efforts to prepare for a future conflict with China. The report reads, quote, "The U.S. ability to focus on its other global priorities, particularly competition with China, will remain constrained as long as the war is absorbing senior policymakers' time and U.S. military resources," end quote. The report says that the major risk of a long war in Ukraine is that there would be a, quote, "prolonged elevated risk of Russian nuclear use and a NATO-Russia war," end quote. And it says avoiding those two things, a direct war between NATO and Russia and the risk of Russian nuclear use, the Russia using nukes or just nuclear use in general, is the paramount U.S. priority. It's the main U.S. priority, and I think they're right about that when we're talking about this war. And you think about all the criticism people like me or other people that oppose U.S. intervention in Ukraine get when we say stuff like that, and then here you have this Rand Corporation report saying the same thing. And when it comes to Ukraine retaking more of the territory that Russia has captured, the The report says that this is only a less significant benefit. Basically, it's saying that avoiding a long war in Ukraine is a higher priority for the United States than facilitating Ukraine capturing more territory. Another thing that I think is pretty obvious, that who controls, the Donbass, Crimea, and Zaporozhia, even, and uh, doesn't matter as much as preventing nuclear war. Um, so what's interesting, though, I mean, it places weakening Russia as a greater benefit to the U.S. than Ukraine's territorial gains. So they're saying weakening Russia is more important to the U.S. than Ukraine, who controls what territory. Basically saying that that's what this war is more about from the U.S. side than it is helping Ukraine. And I think they're right in that assessment. You had Lloyd Austin say back in April that the war was about weakening Russia. And it's clear that that is a major part of it, because it really doesn't matter to the U.S. who controls these territories. But anyway, so they say, weakening Russia is a greater benefit, but it's still not worth the risk of a long war. They say that the risks outweigh the benefits. And the report recognizes that there is currently little hope for peace talks, but they suggest that the U.S. could condition future military aid on a Ukrainian commitment to negotiations. Another suggestion to foster negotiations is for the U.S. to establish conditions for sanctions relief for Russia, what they need to do to get some of the sanctions rolled back. And the authors acknowledge that the Biden administration has made no efforts to push the warring sides toward peace talks. The conclusion says that due to the political situation in Ukraine, a dramatic shift in U.S. policy toward Ukraine is unlikely. So they're saying because of the politics in America, we can't expect a big shift like this. But they said, quote, developing these instruments now and socializing them with Ukraine, with U.S. allies, might help catalyze the eventual start of a process that could bring this war to a negotiated end in a time frame that would serve U.S. interests, end quote. Basically saying start introducing these ideas, start talking about it. And what's interesting is that we had Mark Milley start talking about it this past fall, saying that the winner would provide an opportunity for peace talks. But he lost the battle in the administration. Clearly, the State Department, National Security Council, much more hawkish than the military on this issue. They went out. And what's really, just sad about this whole thing, I mean, a lot is very tragic about this war, of course. Just the fact that, earlier in the war, there was a deal on the table, tentative deal that would have involved Russia pulling back to the February 24th, pre-February 24th lines in exchange for, Ukraine's neutrality and some other things. And here we have now Russia controls a lot more territory, and now they're saying they're not going to ever return it, that it's going to be Russia forever. And we're just going to end up with basically a similar situation to what that previous deal would have been, except Russia controls more territory, and there's a lot more dead people, Ukrainians and Russians. And so, all this for what? And I think it's clear that this is all for the American side about weakening Russia. Okay, so the next one here, more airstrikes reported in Syria near the Iraq border. So these reports are still unverified, but there were unverified reports have said that 2 more airstrikes were launched in eastern Syria on Monday near the Iraqi border following a strike in the area that was reported on Sunday night. And Israel is suspected of being behind the attack since it has previously launched similar airstrikes in the region. So this is according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is, they're based in Britain. They're pro-Syrian opposition, anti-Assad government. But they usually don't just, make things up when it comes to these strikes. They're usually, report airstrikes in this part of Syria are pretty accurately reported, although the death tolls and casualty numbers kind of change a lot. So those are tough to nail down. But anyway, so they said that, so there was the strike Sunday night that I went over yesterday, and they said that a second strike took place Monday morning when what they described as an Iranian-backed militia leader likely referring to an Iraqi Shia militia leader, was inspecting the site of Sunday's strike in the Al Bukamal border region. So the observatory said that the leader and two of his non-Syrian escorts were killed in an airstrike launched by drones. So they're saying this guy went to inspect the airstrike from Sunday and was drone striked while he was there. And then later in the day, the observatory said that an airstrike hit an oil tanker in the same region that was allegedly carrying weapons, killing at least one person. In total, the observatory said that 11 people have been killed since the strike started on Sunday night, but the toll is not verified, and the observatory often changes their reports. Earlier, they said 10 people were killed in the airstrike on Sunday, but now they're saying 7 people were killed on Sunday. But still, I mean, that's a decent amount of people that have been killed so far. And they also claimed that the convoy of refrigerator trucks that was targeted on Sunday night was carrying weapons. However, other reports contradicted that claim, with sources telling Al Mayadeen, which is a Lebanon-based media outlet, that the convoy did not carry weapons. But adding to the likelihood that Israel was responsible for the attacks, Israeli media reported that Israeli officials on Monday held discussions on potential Iranian retaliation for the airstrikes on the convoys. And the airstrikes on Monday came as Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Israel. He arrived in Israel on Monday to hold talks with the Netanyahu government. And in November, Israel launched a series of airstrikes. Not so much a series of airstrikes, but they launched airstrikes on a convoy of trucks in eastern Syria after they entered the country from Iraq. And Israel, they frequently bomb Syria, but they rarely, acknowledge individual strikes. But the former head of the IDF, the Israeli military, confirmed that Israel was behind that one in November. So that's why Israel is the main suspect here. Although the U.S. has also carried out airstrikes in this region against, the Iraqi Shia militias quite a bit. But usually, when it comes to airstrikes against them, the U.S. claims them, and U.S. Central Command will put out a press release. But we haven't seen that. So that's a lot of airstrikes just in a couple days. And the next one here is related to another Israeli attack. Iran summons Ukraine envoy over Israeli drone attack comments. So Iran's foreign ministry on Monday summoned a Ukrainian envoy over comments made by an advisor to Ukrainian President Zelensky that were made after an apparent Israeli drone attack targeted a facility in the Iranian city of Isfahan on Saturday night. Following the drone attack, Zelensky advisor Mikhailo Podolyak, he wrote on Twitter, quote, "Explosive night in Iran. Drone and missile production, oil refineries. Ukraine did warn you," end quote. So kind of a veiled threat, kind of almost hinting that Ukraine might have been involved. And according to AFP, the Iranian foreign ministry called his comments strange and biased, and they summoned Ukraine's envoy in Tehran for an official explanation from the Ukrainian government on his comments. So as we went over yesterday, the Wall Street Journal reported that Israel was behind the drone attack. And then the New York Times also reported, citing, unnamed officials. But this is typically how Israeli attacks in Iran are attributed. Israel doesn't take credit, but we know Israel has a long history of this type of attacks. And these were said to be done with small quadcopter drones, which Israel has used in Iran over the past couple years. So the New York Times cited an unnamed senior intelligence official who said that the attack was the work of the Israeli spy agency Mossad. And U.S. officials kind of hinted at possible U.S. coordination or involvement in their comments to the Wall Street Journal, saying that the attacks came as the U.S. and Israel have been discussing ways to counter Iran's military capabilities and its growing relationship with Russia. So, U.S. officials told the New York Times that the Saturday night attack was likely prompted by Israel's own reasons rather than potential weapons exports to Russia. Again, this is nothing new for Israel. It doesn't make it any less of a big deal. I think it's pretty incredible how little attention Israel's covert operations inside Iran get. Just last spring in 2022, Israel was behind a series of assassinations and there's another one of these drone strikes that killed an engineer. A series of these attacks. Few people died in Iran, and nobody cared. Anybody barely even noticed it. So I'm not trying to downplay this, but this is um, not necessarily related to the war in Ukraine, is what I'm saying here. And again, Blinken's in Israel now. William Burns, the head of the CIA, was in Israel when these attacks happened. So there's a good chance that the U.S. is in on this and kind of just letting Israel lead it and take the blame for it. All right, so the next article here, just a quick one. This is from Middle East Eye. Russia and Iran launch a payment system as an alternative to SWIFT. So SWIFT is the messaging system for financial transactions that, it's a U.S. led financial system. But Iran and Russia have linked their banking systems, a senior Iranian official said on Monday, a move that will allow the two heavily sanctioned countries with deepening economic ties to trade and conduct business out of the U.S. financial system. The two connected their interbank communication and transfer systems since the 2018 reimposition of sanctions. Iran has been disconnected from the Western-based SWIFT financial messaging system, while many Russian banks were kicked off the platform following Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. So really what this shows is Russia and Iran's growing relationship, which is a direct result of U.S. pressure. And we see this just all over with all these countries that the U.S. places under sanctions: Iran and Venezuela, Russia and China, China and Iran. What happens? They start cooperating together, and then the U.S. says, oh, we got to stop it. And they use it to justify more action and more unilateral measures like sanctions. And this is the cycle that we end up in. I just think it's important to point out how all this stuff is so easily predictable, that this is going to be the result of the U.S. sanctioning, using force against all these countries. All right, so the next article here, Finland says that it will stick by Sweden's side as it's seeking NATO membership. So Finland's foreign minister on Monday reiterated that his country will stick with its original plan of not joining NATO without Sweden, despite Turkey's vows that it won't support Stockholm's membership. So this is Finnish Foreign Minister Pekka Haavisto. I probably am saying that wrong. He said, quote, "Our strong wish is to still join NATO together with Sweden. We have underlined to all our future NATO partners, including Hungary and Turkey, that Finnish and Swedish security go together," end quote. So he's also saying, even though so this came after Erdogan suggested for the first time that Finland could join NATO without Sweden. Erdogan also said Turkey is not going to support Sweden's NATO bid anymore because of this Quran burning protest that was held in front of the Turkish embassy in Sweden. Despite that, Haavisto is hoping that NATO bids will be approved by July. And Erdogan announced last week that Turkey's presidential elections will be held in May, and officials in his government have said that they don't want to bring the issue of Sweden and Finland's NATO bids to the parliament before the election. So it's definitely not going to happen before then. So we'll see how this all plays out. All right, the next article here, this is from the South China Morning Post, and it quotes Chinese analysts. Again, I usually, when it comes to the American side, a lot of analysts, just what analysts and experts say, I kind of avoid. But when it comes to China and the South China Morning Post, their analysts, they're typically familiar with how the Chinese government thinks, and they often get things right. So I thought this was just an important story because it says these Chinese analysts say that the Taiwan warnings show that the U.S. military is preparing for war. So a warning by a U.S. Air Force commander that a military conflict with mainland China could come as early as 2025 implies that the American military is gearing up combat readiness over Taiwan, according to analysts who said the People's Liberation Army, it's the Chinese military, would also boost its deterrence capabilities. And I think it's pretty clear that these military officials that the U.S. military is preparing for war with China. I mean, they're saying that they are. They're all saying they are. They're not all predicting war with China like this 4-star general Mike Minihan said the other day, but they're saying explicitly, we're preparing for war with China. It's no secret. But I think This shows how China is going to respond by building up their military and preparing for war with the U.S. If this is what the U.S. is doing. And they quoted some Chinese analysts who said that such warnings may encourage American pilots to become more aggressive. And that's probably right. If they're being deployed over there with this idea that they could be fighting a war in just a couple years. On the last article in the news section, there was a huge suicide bombing in Pakistan, and it killed at least 59 people. It was at a mosque. More than 150 others were wounded. It's not clear exactly who did it yet. The Tariqi Taliban, somebody involved with them claimed responsibility for the attack on Twitter, but then hours later, the Tariqi Taliban spokesperson distanced the group from the bombing, saying that it was not its policy to target mosques, seminaries, and religious places. But he didn't address why a TTP commander initially claimed responsibility for the bombing, but just a big, horrible attack in Pakistan. That's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Ron Paul. The real disinformation was the Russiagate disinformation hoax. Well, I read that all wrong. The real disinformation was the Russia disinformation hoax. And he's talking about the Twitter files and just basically how all this Russiagate stuff was cooked up. And that's something I should be following more closely, the Twitter files, because they're exposing some pretty big things about Russiagate, which I think played such a big role in kind of priming people for the U.S. Supporting this proxy war against Russia. One from Bradley Devlin over at the American Conservative. Thanks a lot, Joe, about Biden sending the Abrams tanks to Ukraine. One from Chip Gibbons over at Jacobin. WikiLeaks has been persecuted mercilessly for revealing the secrets of U.S. empire. One from Anatol Levin over at Responsible Statecraft. First artillery, then tanks, then warplanes, then what? Just talking about the escalatory path that we're on. And then one from Aaron Mate over at his Substack. NATO's war against Russia inches closer to direct conflict. Again, about all this escalation. And the quotes he's using there, are from the Germany's foreign minister and the New York Times. So it's not, just people like us warning about these dangerous escalations. But that is it from me for today. We're done with our fundraiser again, but you could always support the show at antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble. All that stuff helps, and I appreciate all the comments on YouTube. I know a lot of people always comment. That's great. That helps out. The engagement is good. Share the show if you listen to the audio version, which most of you do. You could leave a review, or again, just share it around. Tell people to listen to the show. That's it for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.